How does Brook already know of the Gods Knights? What is his connection with Gunko? And what made him finally take up the pirate flag? These are just some of the questions that I've been wondering since we got a snippet of Gunko's flashback earlier in Elbaf. At least before Emu came in and interrupted it, which, by the way, Emu, I did take some offense to that because Brook is my favorite character in the series, and we've waited over 17 years now for any more information on this period of Brook's life, where he was the leader of a battle convoy for a certain kingdom, and right when it finally gets started, you just had to come in and ruin it. But you know, that's alright, because not only did it just give me more time to do this video and think through what their past is all about, but we also just heard about a crucial change in Volume 112 that really impacts the landscape on Gunko theories as a whole. And that change is that Gunko is actually from the Manmayer family, who we saw a member of competing against Garling during God Valley. Originally, Gunko had no family name or saint in her intro box, but in Volume 112, it appears that's no longer the case. And she has the female suffix for saint next to her name now, so overall it's a pretty big change. And a lot of people, myself included, thought the fact that her name was so different from the others indicated that she was kind of under them, or was maybe simply an outsider that they were manipulating, or at least just didn't have the same stature as the others. Especially with Gunko translating to military child, but now it seems she is a full-blown celestial dragon just like the others. Although maybe not natural born, but regardless, she has the same naming scheme as everyone else. But since she does still have this past with Brook, that means we have a lot of things to figure out, and maybe even more than before. So I'm guessing she was asked to join like Loki was, since he commented on how he doesn't want to become a celestial dragon, or maybe more accurately, Gunko was forced into it somehow, and was maybe adopted by the Manmayer family and brainwashed to a certain extent. Because if you go back and look at what happened when Gunko was first taken over by Emu, it's like those memories of Brook were forgotten or locked away. Because it wasn't until Gunko realized who Brook was and had these memories flood back to her, and even start running toward him, that Emu felt the need to step in. It feels like Gunko was either brainwashed or under a spell of some kind, and once Colin started yelling daddy, it triggered some of those memories and maybe loosened Emu's control or loosened the brainwashing in some way. But I think it's important to note here that her father likely isn't Brook, since she's calling him by his name instead of just dad. So I agree with what most of the community has been saying thus far, which is that Brook was probably more of like a royal protector of sorts, kind of like what Pell or Igaram is to Vivi, but since she looks a little bit older in this panel where she's actually yelling father, it seems like Colin's cries for help reminded her of some trauma that she went through in the past, and that kind of broke the spell. Which reminds me a lot of what Sabo went through after he read the news about Ace. That trauma was kind of a trigger for all of those latent memories to come flooding back, which makes double sense since Sabo was also attacked by the world government via the Celestial Dragons, and this whole Sabo thing might make triple sense if Gunko really was adopted by the Manmayers. Because remember, Sabo was born into nobility, but kept wanting to leave, and so his family ended up adopting another child who fit more into their lifestyle, who turned out to be Stelly. So maybe the Manmayer's original child left Marijois, like Sabo kept leaving his family, or like we saw with the Doflamingo family, so they needed a replacement, thus why they took Gunko. And this would line up even better if Gunko was already from nobility, so maybe they thought she'd fit right in, thus why they targeted her. Although obviously it still necessitated some brainwashing, because like we just said, her trauma seemed to loosen the control that they had on Gunko, which forced Emu to take back over. Which is kinda similar to something that we talked about in my last Gunko video as well, which is Victoria Sindri from Thriller Bark. Because there were some moments towards the end where Hogback's orders didn't really work, and she was sort of battling between her body's will and her shadow's will, and by the very end, she ended up not saving Hogback, and she smiled just like she did before she died, and Gunko sort of reminds me of that, except Emu was able to reassert control before she could actually disobey. And remember earlier in the arc when Gunko kicked Brook and then held her heart afterward? I could see that being like a small sign that it kind of pained her to hurt someone that she cared about. It might have been almost like an automatic reaction because her real self wouldn't have wanted to do that, but maybe that wasn't enough to break the spell or whatever Emu was doing, but this moment with Colin was. And there was also that line from Guernica from Wano, which I brought up like a million times by now, about how he envied Drake pursuing his own sense of justice, like he was unable to do so himself. And I'm wondering if we're now seeing exactly why you can't pursue your own sense of justice. Either you get vaporized like Saturn did, or even controlled outright like we see here with Gunko. And that Victoria Sindri idea actually ties to something really important that I think has kind of gone under the radar, which is the 21 grams of soul. We heard Vegapunk talk about this with Kuma during Egghead while discussing how Kuma's powers can give a physical form to the intangible. And since a body was said to lose 21 grams whenever they died, that was said to be the weight of the soul. But Vegapunk also mentioned that this was studied by a certain scientist from the West Blue. And who was that scientist? Well, probably none other than the once world-renowned Dr. Hogback, who is from the West Blue. The very same guy who was so obsessed with Sindri that he decided to reanimate her corpse. I have a very strong suspicion that whatever Imu is doing with Gunko right now is in the very same vein as Hogback, except Imu's utilizing the soul instead of a shadow. And there's also been tons of theories already that Imu might have some obsession with princesses, thus why he's going after Vivi now and may have done something to Lily. And it seems Gunko could be from royalty as well, which we'll get into in just a little bit. So while I'm not entirely convinced that it's just a weird love obsession thing, just like for Hogback, it does seem that Imu wants these girls under control for one reason or another. And this actually connects to Brook specifically really well, because if there is anyone in One Piece who understands these 21 grams, it has to be him. The dude died and his soul literally flew around looking for his body. I think that cloud is his 21 grams. And now Brook's able to live and move without organs, muscles, or tendons, and it's all due to his soul, and some special energy that lets him stay on this mortal plane. So just like we saw on Whole Cake Island, where Brook was able to counter the chest keepers with his own powers, I think he's gonna have a big role to play here in getting past Imu as well. Not that he'll be able to counter Imu in a general sense, just like how he couldn't really stop Big Mom or her main homies, but he's definitely gonna be vital in at least understanding what's going on. And since we already saw that Gunko's memories of him already kind of drove her to break free from this hypnosis, and we know how music is tied to emotion and the soul, even driving the people in Brook's time skip to finally fight back, I can definitely see Brook freeing Gunko specifically, but nobody else, by maybe playing a song from their past that she liked, which is an idea that the community has thrown around quite a bit, or maybe all of this is just what's going to drive Brook to finally awaken his devil fruit, and that's how he's able to help Gunko. But as far as what actually happened in Gunko's past, I think we need to start by looking at the timeline. Because Brook is 90 years old right now, and you can probably assume that he had to be an adult or close to it to join the battle convoy. So the earliest that this could be is 72 years ago, and since Brook was lost in the Florian Triangle starting 52 years ago, that sets the overall timeline at about 72 to 52 years in the past. But the problem with that timeline is that Gunko sure doesn't look to be 60 or 70 years old. I mean, she was already 6 to 8 or so in that panel, so she should definitely be an old woman at this point. But instead, she looks like she's 20 or 30. And this is probably why Brook second-guessed himself earlier this arc when he said, that woman? No, it couldn't be. And even in chapter 1149, he said, they really do look alike, right before Gunko got taken over by Imu. It's like Brook already noticed the resemblance between them, but the timelines don't match, so he thinks he must be mistaken. Which, I gotta say, it is pretty funny that Brook is having this thought about Gunko, because Gunko and even Laboon probably think something similar about him. Brook is supposed to be dead. He's a skeleton now. And if it wasn't for the afro or the music, you probably couldn't convince anyone who he really is. He's also supposed to be 90 years old anyway and could have just died from old age at this point. So it's kind of like both he and Gunko shouldn't exist in the current times as they are, but they do. So it appears that Gunko just doesn't age anymore, just like the Gorosei appeared not to, since Saturn looked the same at God Valley as he did in Egghead. But Garling, on the other hand, does age. We've seen that transformation from God Valley until now, and he was the supreme commander of the God's Knights, so I think we have to ask what's going on here. Why did Gunko get what appears to be eternal youth, but Garling didn't? Well, I do have some answers for this, but it depends on whether Gunko is taken from God Valley, which does make some sense since Brook is from the West Blue, which is where God Valley was, and maybe this Manmayer God's Knight became her new mom or something, or if she and Brook faced a completely separate earlier cleansing on a different island, one before Brook ever set sail as a pirate, which is also possible since we know that cleansings happen every 3 years. Because if it's the former, I think this mystery is a lot harder to figure out. Maybe you could chalk it up to Garling being a natural-born celestial dragon and Gunko being an adopted one, because maybe Imu has to do something to control control her that Emu doesn't have to do to the other nobles, and a side effect of that could just be eternal youth. But I honestly doubt that she was taken from God Valley for 3 main reasons. Number 1 is simply that Brook wouldn't have been there. God Valley was 38 years ago, meaning that Brook would have been lost in the Florian Triangle for 14 years at that point. And maybe it's just me, but I feel like all of this is going to hit a lot harder if Brook was actually there and saw Gunko get taken. It would also add to his disbelief that she's even still alive, and make for a much more fulfilling reunion when it finally happens. And this leads to my second point, which is that Brook has to know of the God's Knights somehow, and a cleansing seems like the perfect time. If he was in the battle convoy, or what he also called the royal raiding party, he probably would have been the first line of defense if the God's Knights made a move, thus explaining how he knew them. Now, it could also be that Brook's kingdom just went to the Reverie a few times, providing a chance for him to meet the God's Knights there too, since he would have escorted the royalty. But then that also leads me to my third point, which is that we already saw the King of God Valley get clapped by Garland in the flashback. As I mentioned earlier, it feels like Brook was almost a Pell or Igaram tasked with protecting the princess, which means that Gunko's dad would have been the king. And again, I don't know about you, but if Brook's king, who he put his life on the line for and likely delayed his dream for, just got offed in a side panel like that, it's gonna feel a little odd. This guy feels like someone who deserves more respect and build up in the story, especially if we're led to believe that Gunko was crying off to the side after that and we just didn't see it. So while it's certainly possible that Gunko was taken from God Valley, and I don't mean to rule it out, I am leaning a lot more towards this happening at an earlier cleansing, and I have 3 reasons for that as well. One is that this would explain what made Brook become a pirate. Since we saw his dream was to be a pirate while he was still working his old job, it tells me he probably felt some duty to protect them, which is why he stuck around. So having the country fall and the king die could very well be what forced him to make the change. He'd also probably be like a fugitive at this point from running for the government, so he wouldn't have much of a choice. And if cleansings happen every 3 years, and God Valley was 38 years ago, that means we'd have cleansings at 41, 44, 47, 50, and 53 years ago, and so forth. And 53 is conveniently 1 year before he got lost with the Rumbar pirates. So I think that would probably be when it happened. I tried finding some concrete evidence on how long they sailed in total to try and match up with this timeline, but it seemed pretty vague, so we'll just go with 53 for now, although it doesn't really matter that much. And then reason number 2, which is probably the biggest one, is that this could solve the aging dilemma. Because what's the one way we know of for sure that you can get eternal youth in One Piece? By using the eternal youth surgery via the Op fruit. And what was a major focus of God Valley? Those 6 prizes that the God's Knights were competing for, 2 of which we already know were very important and powerful devil fruits. And as I broke down in this video on those fruits, I think one of them almost has to be the Op fruit. It later had a 5 billion berry bounty, and losing it at God Valley could explain why they had to do that. Doflamingo built it up as a tool to help him take over the world. It grants eternal freaking youth, and overall it seems like something the government would definitely want. Maybe the top prize for winning the cleansing games was eternal youth. But since God Valley was raided by Rox and Roger, and Ginny and Kuma also did their thing, the fruits were all taken by other parties, meaning the government lost control of the Op fruit, which explains why Garling was never able to get the operation. But if Gunko was taken before this all happened, she may have just gotten it from an earlier cleansing that she or the Manmayer family in general participated in, maybe before Garling was even old enough to compete. And I really like this answer because recently we've seen immortality in one sense via the regeneration, but eternal youth is kind of a different type of immortality, right? To be truly immortal, you sorta need both. Like if you take damage but don't age, you can still die, and the same goes if you do age but don't take damage. There's kinda 2 sides to immortality here, and I think the aging part might come from the Op fruit, and the regeneration might come from Emu's Abyss shenanigans. And if this was all true, it adds even more emphasis to God Valley, right? It wouldn't just be a hype fest between all the strongest people of the past era, or a major event where tons of slaves were saved, but it could have also greatly impacted one of the government's greatest strengths, since they wouldn't be able to do the eternal youth surgery anymore. And then my third reason for thinking that this all happened at a prior cleansing is that this could also explain how Brook got his devil fruit. Because if God Valley had fruits to give away, then you would think other cleansings did as well. And the revive fruit definitely seems like one that the government would be interested in. I tried looking through the wiki to see if we knew exactly when Brook got his fruit to kind of connect to this, and it did say around 52 years ago, but I couldn't find any concrete details in the manga, even with the chapters that they cited there, so I think this is all left vague on purpose. However, we did see that before his whole crew died, they mentioned his fruit in such a way where they clearly understood it was going to bring him back to life, and that got me thinking, how did they know? Brook's fruit is very, very unique in that it only activates when you die, so they had to get this power confirmed through some other means. Could it be as simple as the Devil Fruit Encyclopedia? Yes, certainly, but we saw that even government agents such as Kaku and Kalifa weren't able to know their fruit powers before they ate them. So instead, I wonder if Brook heard about its ability before he got it during his cleansing. Kinda like how Ginny told the whole world about the fruits at God Valley, and maybe Brook ate it almost as an attempt to just survive by coming back later once the cleansing was done. As in, maybe someone would kill him not knowing he ate it, so they'd leave his body there, and then he could just come back later after the aftermath and somehow escape. And that kind of idea mirrors what we saw in Kuma's flashback pretty well, right? He ate his fruit to help him save himself as well as 500 other people. And this actually builds on a lot of other parallels we've already been seeing between Kuma's and Brook's backstories, starting with the way they began. Remember at the start of the video when I mentioned Brook's backstory getting interrupted by Emu? Well, we even had a similar thing happen in Egghead with Kuma's flashback, where we got a small glimpse of it early on in the arc with Bonnie touching the bubble, which acted as basically a teaser for the amazing flashback that we got about 25 to 30 chapters later. And obviously a major part to Kuma's backstory is what happened at God Valley, and the prevailing thought about Brook is that he is also tied to a cleansing of some kind. We also have the parallel where Ginny was later taken by the government and Gunko was taken at some point as well, not to mention the fact that Brook and Kuma were both introduced in the very same arc on a chunk of land from the West Blue no less, which is where Brook and God Valley are both from, so I think we're gonna see a lot of parallels between these two, including how Brook got his devil fruit. I mean, even their fruits are basically upside down versions of one another. And another thing that might give a little bit of credence to the idea that Brook took their fruit is his bounty, because his original bounty that we saw with the Rumbar Pirates was 33 million berries, and we learned recently with Dory and Brogy that inflation does exist in One Piece, because their bounty went from 100 million to 1.8 billion after 100 years. And those numbers do match up to actual real-world inflation, by the way, so if I bust out my handy-dandy inflation calculator, 33 million berries would be the equivalent to about 240 million today if we account for 52 years of inflation. And that's even higher than Robin's initial bounty after O'Hara accounting for inflation, so perhaps that's a hint that Brook was kind of a big deal back then. My personal headcanon at this point is actually that Brook was offered to join the God's Knights, but refused like Loki did, which would make him even more of a Chad. And now, of course, I think you'd have to wonder why the government didn't update his bounty later, since they did figure out who he really was, but regardless of that, it's still a pretty massive initial bounty for the time period. But if Gunko and Brook are from a separate kingdom that got cleansed, then what kingdom could that be? Well, the popular theory on this for a really long time has been the kingdom of Teroa. I first heard of this from another YouTuber named Dawn of the World, and there is some really strong evidence to think this is true because of Byron, the slave who we met at Sabaody. He dressed in nicer clothes like Brook, it was said that he could play any instrument, they also mentioned he could make wine, and Brook's obviously famous for singing Bink Sake, which is rice wine, but there is a little bit of a caveat here, which is that they said Byron was 25 years old, or 27 years old now that we're past the time skip. And at first I thought this meant there was no chance this could work since the island would have been cleansed well before 27 years ago, but then I also got to thinking, who's to say every island that faces a cleansing gets erased like God Valley? That event is really special in that it was raided by so many strong forces, and the fruits got taken and all that, but most cleansings throughout history have likely gone on without a hitch. Plus, the reason the government went to God Valley specifically was for their resources, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to literally erase the island if you needed to extract things from it. So I don't think they try to erase the island in totality every single time, but rather they probably just cleanse the island of the people, thus why it's called a native cleansing, so that nobody can even report on the atrocity they committed or ever come back for revenge. Kind of like how the government's hiding the Void Century from everyone because that was a giant war, except this is just like a smaller version. So actually, Byron being a slave slave at 25 years old could kind of be evidence that this all lines up, because perhaps the government's completely subjugated the people from the island, so it's almost like a slave factory at this point, which could also tie to why Dragon is liberating so many different countries, because who knows what the government's done to some of these places to force them to submit. And if Gunko is from there and became a slave of some sort, whether through brainwashing or other means, then we already know they like taking slaves from there, so who knows. And I did have a couple more things I wanted to cover in this video, but because I edited and then had to re-edit and then re-edited this video again due to all the different reveals we've been getting recently, I wasn't sure where to splice this last part back in, so I figured I'd just throw it here as some food for thought. But the first thing I want to say is that you guys know how much I love Brook, but even I am very surprised at how much focus he's gotten so far in Elbaf. I think a lot of us have been expecting that this will be Usopp's arc, and yes, there's still plenty of time for him to turn it around, of course, but Brook has seriously stolen the show thus far, and I can't complain. But maybe I shouldn't have been that surprised, because if any of the Straw Hats were going to have a connection with the Gods Knights, and maybe even help break that spell that they're under, it would be Brook. Because we already saw that they and the Gorosei used the summoning circles, which Brook saw during his time skip, and those were said to be tied to the underworld, and Brook has been there before. He also literally died and came back to life, and the Gods Knights have been called immortal or zombies. And we even got this line from Gunko recently about how a life taken cannot be returned, which is true for everyone except Brook. And also, when Saturn was killed by Emu, he was basically vaporized except for his skeleton, which might be like a little bit of symbolism since all Brook has left is his skeleton and his afro. So I think a lot of these different elements that Oda's been kind of laying out revolve around the idea of what really constitutes death, which was the chapter title for Saturn's death, by the way. So in some ways, maybe we all should have been expecting some flashback like this entire time. But alright guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, then a like and subscribe would go a long way to helping with the algorithm and getting to 100K, which is right around the corner. But if you want to hear even more about what's going on in Elbaf, then make sure to head over to my second channel, where I just did a long discussion about chapter 1153 and all the Loki reveals, which, my god, this panel with Loki climbing up the Atom Tree is probably the hardest in the entire series. So make sure to go check that out if you can, and until next time, later.